The dimly lit room was tense, filled with the heavy smell of cigars and leather. The soft hum of the chandelier above was the only sound that accompanied the low murmurs of the men in suits scattered around the grand table. They were here for business. Business that was about to change everything. Alejandro Russo, the infamous Mafia boss, sat at the head of the table, his dark eyes scanning the room with the precision of a hawk hunting its prey. He was a man used to control, used to making decisions that others feared to even consider. His presence was enough to command silence. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice low and authoritative, "we are about to settle this once and for all. But there is one rule tonight. The first woman who walks through that door is mine." His words hung in the air, almost daring anyone to question them. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. "Understood?" The men nodded, their gazes flicking toward the door, unsure if it was a test, a challenge, or something far more dangerous. They knew better than to argue with Alejandro. He wasn't a man who made empty statements. And then, as if on cue, the door swung open. All eyes turned toward the woman who entered the room. She wasn't what anyone expected. Tall, confident, with a quiet grace that seemed to command attention without effort, her dark hair cascaded around her shoulders, and her piercing blue eyes took in the room, scanning every man with the precision of someone who wasn't afraid of being there. Alejandro's gaze locked onto hers the moment she stepped inside. His lips curled into a knowing, predatory smile. This was no coincidence. The room went silent as the woman took her first step toward the center of the room, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as though the entire world had paused, waiting for Alejandro's next move. "Well," Alejandro said slowly, his voice thick with anticipation, "it looks like I got what I wanted." The woman, still silent, met Alejandro's gaze. Her eyes didn't waver, and though there was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, there was no fear. That was what struck him the most. She wasn't scared. She wasn't running. She wasn't intimidated by the notorious Mafia boss that everyone else in the room trembled before. She stood still, her back straight, her shoulders squared. There was a quiet strength in her that almost seemed out of place in a room filled with hardened men. Alejandro leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, never breaking eye contact. His smile deepened, and he spoke again, this time with an edge of curiosity in his tone. "And who might you be?" Her voice cut through the air, steady and calm. "I think you know exactly who I am, Mr. Russo." The words hung in the room like a challenge. The men surrounding the table shifted uncomfortably, unsure if they should be impressed or fearful. But Alejandro remained unfazed, intrigued by her boldness. "You think you can walk in here and claim what I just said?" Alejandro's tone was still smooth, but there was an underlying sharpness. "You must have a lot of nerve." The woman took a step closer, her heels clicking in the silence. "Nerve?" She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Or maybe I just don't have time for games." Alejandro's eyes narrowed. There was something about her. Something dangerous, yet captivating. He leaned back again, eyes scanning her more thoroughly now, as if she were a puzzle that he was eager to solve. The tension in the room escalated, the men around the table holding their breath. The moment was suspended, the air thick with unspoken power dynamics, curiosity, and the looming sense of something far bigger than anyone had anticipated. Finally, Alejandro broke the silence. "Very well, then," he said, his voice low and steady, though the fire in his eyes burned brighter than ever. "It seems you have my attention, miss." "Ellie," she responded, her gaze never leaving his. "Ellie Morgan." Alejandro's smile faded slightly, as if the name struck a chord deep inside him. He studied her carefully for a moment before speaking again, his voice a little quieter this time, as if he were pondering something far beyond their current interaction. "Well, Ellie Morgan," he said, standing up slowly, his towering figure casting a shadow over the room. "You've walked into a world you know nothing about, and I'm curious to see how long you last." Ellie's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I've lasted this long, haven't I?" Alejandro chuckled softly, a sound that was more dangerous than comforting. "True, but the real game begins now." The room was filled with a sense of inevitability. Everyone knew that whatever came next would change everything. The question was, how far would Ellie Morgan go? Alejandro motioned to one of his men, who immediately moved to pour a drink into a crystal glass, his movements quick and practiced. "A drink for our guest," he said, with a look of amusement in his eyes. Ellie Morgan, the woman who thinks she can walk into my world and play by her own rules. Ellie didn't move, her eyes still fixed on him. "I didn't come here to play," she said, her tone sharp, cutting through the thick atmosphere like a knife. "I came here because you've been calling me, stalking me, and sending me flowers. You think I'm just gonna sit down, take your drink, and pretend I'm not scared?" The room fell silent. The men exchanged uneasy glances, and Alejandro, though slightly taken aback by her directness, remained calm. He took a slow sip from his own glass, watching her with a mix of admiration and caution. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't like the women who cowered under his gaze, or the men who caved under pressure. She was something different, and that intrigued him more than anything else. "No," Alejandro said finally, his voice low and soft. "I don't expect you to be scared. But you should be." Ellie's eyes flashed with defiance. "What's your game, Russo? Who are you, really?" The question hung in the air for a moment. The men around the table were silent, each holding their breath, waiting for Alejandro to respond. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, just for a second. It was a flicker of something darker, something deeper, and Ellie saw it. He placed his glass down slowly, then took a step toward her, closing the space between them. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thicker with every inch that separated them. "Who am I?" Alejandro repeated, his voice almost a whisper now, as he stopped just a few feet from her. "I'm the man who makes things happen. The man who can give you everything you could ever want, or take it all away in the blink of an eye." Ellie took a deep breath, standing her ground. "I don't need anything from you. I'm not here for your games. I'm here because someone is trying to use me, and I want to know why." "Why my phone number? Why are you so obsessed with me?" The tension in the room deepened. Alejandro didn't respond immediately, instead studying her with an intensity that seemed to see straight through her. Finally he spoke, his voice laced with the kind of truth that cut deep. "Because you're the key to something much bigger than you realize." Ellie froze, a shiver running down her spine. The room seemed to tilt, and her mind raced to connect the dots. She had no idea what he meant, but one thing was clear. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to imagine. "Bigger?" she whispered almost to herself. Alejandro nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Much bigger." Before she could ask more, the door to the room suddenly slammed open, and a man entered, his eyes wide with urgency. The air shifted again. This time it was a shift of danger. "Boss," the man said, his voice tight with panic. "We've got a problem. There's been a breach at the perimeter." Alejandro's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as he turned toward the man. "What kind of breach?" he asked, his voice colder now. "An unmarked car. 4 men, armed." Ellie's heart raced. She could feel the tension in the room rise, the threat growing stronger. She wasn't part of this world, but it was clear that whatever Alejandro was mixed up in was dangerous. And now, somehow, she was caught in the middle of it. Alejandro's gaze flicked back to her, a brief moment of calculation crossing his face. Then, without another word, he turned back to the men in the room. "Get everyone to the safe room," he commanded, his voice firm and final. "Ellie, come with me, now." Before she could react, he was already moving toward the door, and she had no choice but to follow. The hallways of Alejandro's mansion were eerily silent as they rushed through them. Ellie's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything happening around her. One moment she had been standing in a room filled with powerful men, and the next, she was being dragged into what felt like a life-or-death situation. She had never signed up for this. She was just a nurse, someone who dealt with pain and sickness, not mafia wars and criminal intrigue. But the look in Alejandro's eyes when he said, "Come with me," made it impossible for her to say no. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just pulling her into this for no reason. There was something about her connection to this world, that was undeniable. As they approached a large metal door at the far end of the hallway, Alejandro didn't slow down. His bodyguard, Marco, stood watch by the entrance, his hand resting on the handle of a gun holstered at his side. He gave Ellie a curt nod before stepping aside to let them through. Inside, the room was stark and sterile, a stark contrast to the rest of the mansion's opulent decor. The walls were reinforced with metal, the lighting dim and functional. Ellie had expected something more luxurious, more lavish, but this place felt cold, calculated, and that was exactly the point. This was where Alejandro kept his secrets safe. The door slammed shut behind them, and the sound echoed through the room. The atmosphere shifted. This was no longer a place for pleasantries or threats. It was a place of business, where people made decisions that could cost lives. "Stay here," Alejandro commanded, his voice commanding as he moved toward a console along one of the walls. His hands flew over the buttons, his focus intense. "You're safe for now." Ellie, still in shock, didn't argue. She stayed where she was, trying to collect her thoughts. The sound of her breathing echoed in the sterile room, her chest rising and falling rapidly as her mind raced. She had so many questions, but no answers. Her eyes flicked toward the heavy door behind her. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the air thick with tension. Whoever these men were, they were coming for something, and somehow she was involved in it. Alejandro's voice broke her train of thought. "The safe room is only temporary," he said, his back turned as he continued to work the console. "We need to buy some time until we can deal with this. We're going to move you to a more secure location." Ellie's gaze shifted to him. The same Alejandro who had once seemed like a distant, untouchable figure was now standing before her, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. His usually confident posture was stiff, his jaw clenched. This wasn't just about power anymore. This was personal. "Why me?" Ellie finally asked, her voice shaking but determined. "Why did you pick me? You know nothing about me." Alejandro paused, his back still turned. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, when he spoke, his voice was almost softer than she'd expected. "Because of that night. That wrong number call." Ellie's blood ran cold at the mention of the call. It felt like it happened ages ago. But the memory was still fresh in her mind. The confusion, the coldness in his voice. He had known something she didn't. He had been expecting someone else, someone who had disappeared with a valuable piece of information. "You're not here by accident, Ellie," he continued. "That call wasn't a mistake. Your phone number, it's connected to something much bigger, something I've been hunting for years." Ellie's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Before Alejandro could respond, a loud bang echoed from outside the door. Ellie stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the sound of a door opening. It was a warning. Alejandro's hand moved to his side, where a sleek black pistol was holstered beneath his jacket. The cold steel was now in his hand, and his eyes darkened with the weight of the situation. "It's starting," he muttered under his breath. He moved quickly to the door, his expression a mask of calm determination. Ellie could feel the tension building again, her heart pounding in her chest. She was in way over her head, and there was no turning back now. Alejandro turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Stay here. Don't move unless I say so." Ellie nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. This wasn't just about a wrong number anymore. This was about something much larger, something tied to her father's past, something that had come back to haunt her. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and Alejandro's posture shifted, the air around him crackling with intent. The game had changed, and Ellie had just become a key player in a dangerous world she wasn't ready for. Alejandro's hand hovered near the door handle, his muscles taut as he listened intently for any movement outside. The footsteps were getting closer, quick, heavy strides that echoed down the corridor. Every instinct in him screamed to move, take action. But he held still. The only sound in the room the rapid beat of Ellie's heart and the steady hum of the mansion's systems. "Stay behind me," Alejandro said in a low, controlled voice, barely above a whisper, though Ellie could hear the raw edge of urgency in his tone. She didn't question him. There was no time to. He opened the door a crack, just enough to peer out, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the hallway. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The Mafia boss's usual confidence had given way to the meticulous precision of a man who was always 5 steps ahead, until now. His eyes met Ellie's one last time before he swung the door open fully, and moved with fluid precision, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting of the mansion. Ellie followed closely behind him, her every nerve alight with a mix of fear and anticipation. She had no idea who these men were or what they wanted, but she trusted Alejandro, at least enough to follow his lead. They moved silently down the hallway, a few sharp turns leading them to a small, dimly lit room at the back of the house. It was a command center, hidden beneath the surface of the mansion's elegance, with multiple monitors displaying the security feeds, maps, and live communications from Alejandro's men. This was the heart of the operation, the place where decisions were made and orders given. Alejandro moved quickly, pulling up a new feed that showed the approaching cars on the security cameras. There were 3, each one black and sleek, almost too refined. Kazan's men, he muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the screens. They're already here. Ellie stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly. Who are they? Alejandro didn't look at her as he replied, his focus still fixed on the screens. Enemies. Rivals. But more dangerous than anyone else I've ever dealt with. He turned to face her then, his expression colder than she'd seen before. They're not here for me. They're here for you. The words hit her like a ton of bricks. For her. The realization washed over her with a chilling clarity. She was the reason this was happening. She was the reason the violence had come to her doorstep. But why? Her voice was barely above a whisper, her mind racing to make sense of it all. Alejandro's gaze softened, just slightly as he moved toward her. He stood in front of her, blocking her view of the monitors. Because your father wasn't who you think he was. And neither are you. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. What are you talking about? The words felt foreign on her tongue, a distant echo of the life she thought she knew. Alejandro stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the small room. He spoke with quiet intensity, each word deliberate. Your father was involved in something bigger than accounting. He worked for the Valentini family before his accident. He paused, eyes flickering with something unreadable. And now somehow Kazan believes you have information that could destroy everything. Ellie shook her head, disbelief flooding her. No, that's not possible. My father wasn't involved in anything like that. Alejandro's eyes softened briefly, his hand reaching out to gently touch her shoulder. I know you don't want to believe it, but the evidence is there. It's all connected. Your father hid something that could bring down Kazan and his entire operation. And now, they're coming for you to get it. The weight of his words hung in the room like a heavy cloud. Ellie wanted to scream, to deny it all, but the truth had already begun to sink in. Everything she thought she knew about her father, the quiet man who had raised her alone after her mother's death, was a lie. He had been involved in something dark, something dangerous, and now she was part of it. So what now? Ellie asked, her voice raw with emotion. Alejandro's expression hardened. Now we survive, and we find what they're looking for before they do. Before she could respond, the door to the room burst open, and Alejandro's men stormed in, their guns drawn and their expressions grim. Marco, the man who had been at the mansion's entrance, stepped forward, his eyes locked on Alejandro. Boss, we need to move. They've breached the perimeter. They're inside the house. Alejandro didn't flinch. He was in his element now, calm, controlled, decisive. He nodded once, his eyes flashing with determination. Get Ellie to safety. I'll handle this. Ellie's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to process everything. She had no choice but to follow. With one last, lingering look at Alejandro, she turned and moved quickly toward the door, Marco close behind her. As they ran, the sound of gunfire echoed through the mansion, sharp and terrifying. It was no longer a question of whether she was in danger. The question was how far she was willing to go to survive. Ellie's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts as she followed Marco through the dimly lit corridors of the mansion. The walls seemed to close in around her, the heavy sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence, only broken by the occasional distant gunshot or the muffled sound of voices. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Everything that had happened in the past hours was a blur, yet it felt as though she were being dragged deeper into something she couldn't escape. Marco, always 2 steps ahead, guided her swiftly through the maze-like hallways. He didn't speak, there was no need. Ellie knew the urgency in his steps. They weren't just running from danger. They were running to something, though she didn't know what that was. They reached the back door of the mansion, a heavy steel door that opened into a small, secluded garden. The garden was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. The air was thick with tension, and Ellie could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest. Her eyes scanned the surroundings, but all she saw were shadows, dark, looming shadows that seemed to be closing in. "Come on," Marco urged, his voice tight with urgency. Ellie's pulse quickened as she followed him down the winding path that led to a hidden side exit, the stone walls surrounding them like silent sentinels. They reached a sleek black SUV parked just outside, the engine already running. Marco opened the door for her and motioned for her to get in. "Get in, now." She hesitated, the reality of the situation finally hitting her. This wasn't just a random attack. They weren't just after Alejandro. They were after her. But why? And what did it all mean? What did her father have to do with any of this? Her mind raced with more questions than she could process. She looked up at Marco, her voice barely a whisper. "Where are we going?" "To safety," he said without turning to look at her, his eyes focused on the rear-view mirror as he reversed the vehicle out of the driveway. "And you'll find out everything soon enough." Ellie swallowed hard, her throat dry. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how little she knew, how out of control she felt. She gripped the seat beneath her, bracing herself for whatever came next. As they drove through the winding streets, Ellie glanced out the window, trying to make sense of it all. The familiar streets of the city, places she had walked countless times, now felt foreign, as though they no longer belonged to her. The shadows seemed darker, the faces more menacing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The car finally pulled into a secluded area on the outskirts of the city, an industrial park, silent and empty at this hour. The only light came from a few scattered street lamps that flickered weakly in the night. "Stay here," Marco said as he turned off the engine. "I'll check the area." Ellie nodded, her hands trembling. She didn't want to be alone, but she also didn't want to argue. She sat back in her seat, her eyes scanning the empty streets outside. It didn't take long for Marco to return, his face serious. "We're clear. Let's go." He led her to a warehouse at the far end of the parking lot, its doors wide open, revealing a stark, sterile interior. Ellie's gut twisted with unease. This wasn't a place of safety. It felt more like a holding cell, a place where people were kept until they were no longer useful. Inside, she was immediately greeted by a few more men. Some she recognized from Alejandro's mansion. Others, she didn't. They all looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, but no one spoke. It was clear they were waiting for something, waiting for Alejandro. A few minutes passed, and Ellie's impatience began to grow. Where was he? What was happening to her? The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind her, and she turned to see Alejandro entering the warehouse, his presence filling the room in a way no one else's could. "Ellie," he said, his voice low and intense, "you're safe now." The weight of his words hit her, but she didn't feel safe. "Not yet. Safe?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking. "How can I be safe when you haven't told me anything? Why are they after me? What did my father do?" Alejandro stepped closer, his eyes studying her carefully. "Your father wasn't just an accountant, Ellie. He was involved in a lot more than you think. He worked with the Valentini family, a powerful organization that launders money for the highest bidders." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She shook her head in disbelief. "No, you're wrong. My father, he was just a simple man. He had a family to take care of. He worked hard. He didn't have anything to do with that." Alejandro's expression softened slightly. "I know it's hard to believe, but it's the truth. Your father got in too deep, and now everything he tried to protect you from is coming back." Ellie took a step back, her mind spinning. "And that's why you're involved, isn't it? Because of what my father was involved in? Because of this thing you're trying to protect?" Alejandro nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I didn't choose this, Ellie. But now that you're involved, I'm not going to let anything happen to you." For the first time since this nightmare began, Ellie looked at Alejandro differently. The man who had once seemed cold, ruthless, and dangerous was now standing in front of her, his jaw tight with determination. He wasn't just protecting her because of some Mafia obligation. He was protecting her because she was part of this world now, and whether she liked it or not, there was no turning back. Ellie stood in the middle of the cold warehouse, her heart heavy with the weight of Alejandro's words. Her entire world had just been turned upside down. Everything she thought she knew about her father, her life, had been shattered in a matter of hours. He wasn't the simple, hard-working man she remembered. He was a part of something dark, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. "I didn't want you to know this way," Alejandro said, his voice a mix of regret and resolve. "But there's no more hiding from the truth." Ellie's mind raced. The pieces of her father's life that she had once viewed as small, insignificant details, now forming a larger, darker picture. A life full of secrets, of betrayal, of criminal alliances. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but deep down she knew. The signs had been there all along, her father's hidden life, his connections, the whispers she overheard growing up. But she had refused to see it. She had chosen to believe in the good man who raised her. Then why me? Ellie's voice was sharp, desperate for some clarity in the midst of the chaos. Why am I involved in this? What does Kazan want from me? Alejandro's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because your father hid something valuable. He wasn't just laundering money, he had access to something much worse. And now, Kazan believes you know where it is." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Alejandro didn't answer immediately. He stepped back, running a hand through his dark hair, as though he were trying to figure out how to explain something too dangerous for her to hear. "It's a hard drive," he said finally. "A file that could destroy entire empires. It contains evidence, things Kazan doesn't want anyone to know. The people who have it control everything, and they will stop at nothing to get it back." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. Her father had been involved in something that could bring down entire criminal organizations. And now Kazan thought she had it. "But I don't have it," Ellie whispered, more to herself than to Alejandro. "I don't know anything about a hard drive." Alejandro's eyes met hers, his gaze unwavering. "The thing is, Ellie, your father was smart. He knew the game. He knew the risks. And before he died, he made sure the hard drive was hidden. He trusted only a few people with that information, and he made sure the only one who could find it was you." Ellie's mind swirled, the pieces of the puzzle continuing to shift and blur. "You mean, my father hid it from me? But I don't know anything about it. I don't even know where to start looking." Alejandro's voice softened, a trace of sympathy creeping into his tone. "You don't have to know everything. Not yet. You just need to trust me." Ellie shook her head. "Trust you? I don't even know who you are, Alejandro. You say you're protecting me, but how do I know you're not part of the same world that's trying to kill me?" Alejandro's expression hardened. "Because I'm not like them, Ellie. You think I wanted to be dragged into this life? I was born into it. This is who I am, and there's no escaping it. But I've spent my entire life fighting for control, for power. I didn't choose to protect you. But now that I have, I'll die before I let anyone harm you." Ellie stood there, speechless, feeling the weight of his words sink in. There was no easy way out of this, no simple explanation. She was trapped in a world she never asked for, and the only person who could guide her through it was the very man who had drawn her in. Before she could respond, a sudden noise from outside the warehouse interrupted the moment, a low, rumbling sound that grew louder with each passing second. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as the sound of engines revving reached her ears. She didn't need to ask what it was. "They're here," Alejandro muttered, his voice hardening with resolve. Without another word, he grabbed Ellie's arm, pulling her toward the back of the warehouse. The men who had been stationed at the entrance moved swiftly, locking the doors and preparing for whatever was coming. The low rumble of the engines outside grew closer, and Ellie could feel the fear in the pit of her stomach. "Who are they?" Ellie asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Kazan's men," Alejandro said. "They'll do anything to get to you. To the hard drive." Ellie's mind raced as they reached a small, concealed exit at the back of the warehouse. Marco was waiting there, his eyes alert, his hand resting on the gun at his side. "They're moving fast," Marco said, his voice steady. "We need to go," Alejandro nodded. "Get Ellie to the safe house. I'll deal with Kazan's men." Ellie turned to him, her eyes wide. You're going to fight them alone? I'm not alone, Alejandro said, his tone colder now, more businesslike. I've been preparing for this. You're the priority. Get her out of here. As Ellie was ushered toward the black SUV, her mind raced. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for, or perhaps dreading. She was about to be thrust into a world of violence, of power struggles and danger that she wasn't prepared for. But there was no turning back now. The moment she answered that phone, her life had changed forever. Ellie barely had time to process the urgency of the moment before she was shoved into the back of the SUV. Marco slammed the door shut behind her, his eyes scanning the surroundings one last time before he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The tires screeched as they sped off into the night, the city's lights flashing by in a blur of yellow and white. Ellie sat back against the seat, her body rigid with fear. She had never been in a car going this fast, not in this kind of situation. Her mind was still reeling from everything Alejandro had told her. Her father's ties to the Mafia, the hard drive, Kazan's men hunting her down. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was already too deep into this world. A world where danger and betrayal lurked behind every corner, where her every move was being watched. Marco was silent as he drove, his expression cold and unreadable, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Ellie didn't know what to say to him, and frankly, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know more. All she wanted was to escape. Escape from the fear, the uncertainty, and the cold grip of reality that had settled over her life. But she couldn't escape, not now. Not when everything she knew had been turned upside down. The car swerved onto a narrow road, the headlights barely illuminating the path ahead. The buildings of the city faded into the distance, replaced by the emptiness of open land. Ellie glanced out the window, watching the darkness consume everything outside. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. This wasn't just about escaping Kazan anymore. It was about surviving this night, and whatever else Alejandro's world had in store for her. After a few minutes of silence, Marco broke it, his voice surprisingly calm. We're almost there. You'll be safe at the safe house. Just keep quiet and don't ask questions. Ellie glanced at him, 1,000 questions bubbling in her chest. But she didn't ask, not now. She wasn't sure she even wanted to know the answers. What good would it do? It wouldn't change the fact that she was tangled in a mess far bigger than she could ever have imagined. They reached a gate, a large iron structure that looked old but sturdy. Marco pressed a button on the dash, and the gates slowly opened with a creak. He drove through them without hesitation, and the SUV rolled down a long driveway lined with trees. At the end of the path, a sprawling mansion came into view, elegant, isolated, and intimidating. Marco parked in front of the grand entrance, and Ellie's stomach churned with unease. The place was like something out of a movie. High walls, security cameras, and guards patrolling the perimeter. This wasn't the kind of place anyone could just walk into. Stay close, Marco ordered as he got out of the car and moved to open her door. Ellie hesitated for a moment, her feet frozen to the ground. She had never felt more out of place in her entire life. This wasn't her world. But as Marco's eyes met hers, there was something unspoken between them. He wasn't just a bodyguard, and she wasn't just some girl caught in a dangerous game. This was survival. For both of them. With a deep breath, Ellie stepped out of the car and followed Marco into the mansion. The moment she stepped inside, she was hit with the smell of rich wood, polished marble, and expensive cologne. The place was luxurious, but there was a coldness to it, like a fortress. The kind of place where secrets were buried and never spoken of. They were greeted by another man, tall and broad-shouldered with a hard expression. His eyes flicked briefly over Ellie, sizing her up before he spoke to Marco in a language Ellie didn't understand. Marco nodded and turned to her. "This is Pietro," Marco said, introducing the man. "He'll make sure you're taken care of. I've got to go deal with the perimeter." Pietro gave Ellie a curt nod and motioned for her to follow him. She moved quickly, her feet shuffling along the cold marble floors, her mind racing. She had to get her bearings. She had to understand what was happening. Pietro led her down a long hallway to a door at the end. He opened it, revealing a large room with simple but comfortable furniture. A bed, a small desk, and a window that overlooked the expansive grounds of the estate. "You'll be safe here," Pietro said, his voice monotone. "Don't leave this room unless directed. And stay quiet." Ellie nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She wasn't interested in staying quiet. She wasn't interested in being kept in the dark anymore. She needed answers. She needed to understand how everything fit together. But as Pietro closed the door behind him, Ellie was left alone in the room, the silence deafening. The feeling of isolation crept over her again, and she sank down onto the edge of the bed. She had no choice but to trust Alejandro for now. But she had no idea what would happen once this was over. The minutes stretched into hours as Ellie sat in the small, sterile room, the weight of everything pressing down on her. She kept replaying the events in her mind. The phone call, the flowers, the hard drive, Alejandro's words, and none of it made sense. How had her father been involved in something so dangerous? Why had he hidden it from her? And why was she now tangled in the same mess? She paced the room, her thoughts racing. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing breaking the oppressive silence. The quiet only served to amplify the noise in her head, a constant barrage of questions and fears. Ellie knew she couldn't stay in this room forever. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening. And the only person who could give her those answers was Alejandro. The sudden creak of the door broke her from her thoughts. She turned to see Marco stepping inside, his expression unreadable. "It's time," he said, his voice low. "Alejandro wants to speak with you." Ellie didn't hesitate. She followed Marco down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of the situation settled over her again, and she felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. The closer they got to Alejandro, the more uncertain she became. What would he say this time? Would he finally tell her everything? Or would he keep her in the dark, trapped in a world she didn't belong to? They reached a large ornate door at the end of the hallway. Marco knocked once before pushing it open. Inside, Alejandro stood by a large desk, his back turned as he stared out of a window that overlooked the estate. His posture was stiff, his hands clasped behind his back, but there was an air of quiet authority about him that made her feel both reassured and unsettled at the same time. When he heard the door open, Alejandro turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers with the intensity that always seemed to be present. But today, there was something different in his eyes. Something almost regretful. "Ellie," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the cold, commanding tone she was used to. "We need to talk." Ellie stepped into the room, her mind racing. "About what?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. "About my father? About this hard drive you keep talking about?" Alejandro nodded slowly, motioning for her to take a seat. "Yes, but more than that. I need you to understand what's at stake here." Ellie didn't move. "You keep saying that, but you've never explained it to me." "I don't understand any of this, Alejandro. I don't know why you're dragging me into your world." There was a brief pause before Alejandro spoke again, his voice steady, but laced with an undeniable urgency. "Because you're not just in my world, Ellie. You're in a world much bigger than mine. The world your father was a part of. The world that's been hunting you since the moment your phone number was linked to that hard drive." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? How am I connected to any of this?" Alejandro walked around the desk, his eyes fixed on her as if weighing his next words carefully. "Your father hid something, Ellie. Something that could bring down some of the most powerful men in the world. And when Kazan's men found out that your phone number was linked to the hard drive, they connected you to it. They think you know where it is, and they will stop at nothing to get it back." Ellie swallowed hard. "But I don't know anything."
"I don't have it!"
"I don't know where it is." "I believe you," Alejandro said quietly. "But Kazan's men don't, and that's why you're a target. That's why they're hunting you." Ellie felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The sheer weight of the truth was more than she could bear. Her father had hidden something that powerful, and now she was in danger because of it. She had always thought her father was just a man trying to make an honest living. But now everything was changing. "What does Kazan want with me?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro's eyes darkened. "Kazan doesn't care about you. Not really. What he cares about is the hard drive. The evidence your father hid. He'll use whatever means necessary to get it back." "But why didn't my father tell me?" Ellie asked, her hands trembling. "Why didn't he warn me? He left me with nothing but a mess." Alejandro stepped closer, his voice softening. "Your father didn't want you involved in this. He didn't want you to be part of this world, but he couldn't protect you from it. And when he realized that, he made sure the only person who could find what he hid was you. He trusted you to keep it safe. Ellie's eyes blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. I don't know how to keep it safe. I don't even know what it is. Alejandro placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You're stronger than you think, Ellie. You just need to trust yourself. And trust me, I won't let anyone hurt you. Ellie looked up at him, the raw intensity in his gaze making her heart race. She wanted to believe him, but trust wasn't something she gave easily, not after everything that had happened, not when she was still trying to piece together the man her father had really been. What do we do now? Ellie asked, her voice hoarse. Alejandro's expression hardened, his jaw clenched. Now we find the hard drive before Kazan does, and we end this, once and for all. The next few hours passed in a blur of tense preparation and hushed conversations. Ellie had no idea what Alejandro had planned, but she could feel the urgency in the air. Every man in the mansion seemed to be on high alert, moving with precision and purpose. She had never seen anything like it before. Everything was calculated, every action deliberate. Marco appeared again, his usual stoic expression more rigid than usual. We've found a lead, he said, his voice low as he approached Alejandro. A location. But it's not easy. We'll need to move fast. Ellie's pulse quickened. What does that mean? Where is it? Alejandro turned to her, his face impassive, but there was a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. It means we don't have much time. Kazan's men are already on the move. If we don't get to it first, they'll have it, and they'll use it against us. Against you. Ellie swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about protecting whatever was hidden, whatever her father had left for her, and keeping it out of Kazan's hands. How do we find it? She asked, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her chest. We follow the trail, Alejandro said, his gaze never leaving the monitors in front of him. Your father left clues and we'll find them. One by one. Ellie's mind raced. What kind of clues? How could she possibly find what her father had hidden when she didn't even know where to begin? But she didn't have time to question it. She had to trust Alejandro, trust that he knew what he was doing, that he wouldn't let Kazan get to her, or the hard drive. Get ready, Alejandro said to Marco, his voice clipped. We leave in 10 minutes. Marco nodded and left the room, disappearing into the mansion's labyrinth of hallways. Ellie stood still, watching Alejandro as he moved around the room, gathering information and preparing for whatever was coming next. There was a calm, methodical air about him that was almost unsettling, as if he had been here before, like he had done this kind of thing countless times. She wasn't sure whether that made her feel safer or more terrified. Finally, Alejandro turned to face her. Ellie, I know this isn't easy, but you need to stay focused. We're going into dangerous territory. You can't let your emotions get the best of you. I'm not afraid, Ellie replied, her voice firmer than she felt. I just want to know the truth. I need to know what happened to my father. Alejandro's expression softened for a moment, and he stepped closer to her. You'll know. Soon enough. But right now, we have to do this. We'll find what's hidden, and we'll make sure Kazan can't touch it. Ellie nodded, though the anxiety gnawing at her insides wouldn't be so easily silenced. She had no idea what kind of danger they were about to walk into, but it was clear that there was no turning back. This was her fight now, whether she was ready for it or not. 10 minutes later, they were in the SUV again, racing down the dark streets of the city, the headlights cutting through the night like a blade. The wind outside howled as they sped toward their destination, some abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, where the lead had taken them. The silence in the vehicle was oppressive. Ellie sitting in the back seat, her heart racing with each passing second. Alejandro's men were quiet, their faces hard and focused, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. Are you sure this is the right place? Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro didn't look at her, his eyes trained on the road ahead. It has to be. Your father's trail led us here. We'll find the hard drive. Ellie's thoughts were a blur as they neared the warehouse. The building loomed ahead, dark and imposing, with only the faintest light visible through cracked windows. She could feel her breath catch in her throat as they pulled into the parking lot, the SUV coming to a sudden stop just outside the entrance. We move quickly, Alejandro said, his voice low. "Stick to the plan. Stay close, and don't make a sound." The men in the vehicle immediately jumped into action, moving swiftly toward the entrance of the warehouse, their steps calculated and silent. Ellie followed Alejandro closely, her heart pounding in her chest. Her legs felt like lead, but she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. They reached the door, and Marco stepped forward, quickly disabling the lock and sliding the door open with barely a sound. The darkness inside was thick, but Alejandro's men were already inside, sweeping the area with military precision. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she followed them in, the cold chill of the warehouse filling the air. "Stay behind me," Alejandro said, his voice sharp with authority. Ellie nodded, her eyes scanning the dark interior. She could barely see anything, but the sounds of movement, the rustling of bodies, the soft tap of shoes on concrete, told her everything she needed to know. They weren't alone. "Someone's here," Marco whispered, his voice tense. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as the sound of footsteps echoed toward them, growing louder with each passing second. Her pulse raced as the darkness around them seemed to close in. "Ready?" Alejandro asked, his eyes locked onto hers. There was no fear in his gaze, only determination. Ellie nodded, her grip tightening around the gun that had been handed to her. This was it, the moment she had been avoiding for so long. The enemy was here, and she wasn't running anymore. The warehouse was eerily quiet now, save for the soft shuffle of feet and the distant hum of machinery somewhere deep in the building. Ellie's hand tightened around the gun. Her fingers were cold, her heart beating too loudly in her chest. She had never imagined she would be in a place like this, armed and ready for a fight. But there was no turning back. She was already in too deep. Alejandro motioned for Marco and the other men to spread out, their eyes scanning every corner of the warehouse with the precision of trained soldiers. Ellie stayed close to Alejandro, her every sense heightened, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They weren't alone anymore. The enemy was coming, and they were coming fast. Alejandro turned to her, his gaze sharp. "Stay close, Ellie. Don't move unless I say so." Ellie nodded, her breath shallow. She wasn't sure she could trust her own instincts in a moment like this. Everything felt out of her control, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't afford to back down. Not now. The moment stretched, the tension in the air so thick it almost felt suffocating. And then, a figure appeared from the shadows. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He wasn't alone. 2 more men flanked him, all 3 of them armed and ready for a fight. "Kazan's men," Alejandro muttered, barely audible. "The moment we've been waiting for." The man at the front stepped forward, a twisted smirk curling at the corner of his lips. "Well, well," he said, his voice deep and menacing. "The great Alejandro Russo. I've been expecting you." Ellie's grip on her gun tightened, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. This was it. This was the moment she had been running from. Alejandro didn't flinch, his face a mask of cold determination. "I didn't come here for pleasantries, Kazan," he said, his voice steady, but with an edge of venom. "I came here for the hard drive, and I'm not leaving without it." Kazan's smirk widened. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what belongs to me? You've underestimated me, Russo. This ends tonight." The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the promise of violence. Ellie's heart raced, her breath shallow. She wanted to scream, to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had to focus. She couldn't let her fear control her. She had a role to play in this fight. Kazan's men took a step forward, their guns raised. Ellie's mind raced as she tried to keep up with the rapid shift in the situation. It was happening too fast. She hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly. Without warning, Alejandro moved, his body a blur of motion as he lunged toward the men. His speed and precision were almost inhuman, his every movement calculated and deadly. The first shot rang out, shattering the stillness of the moment. Ellie's heart skipped a beat, but Alejandro was already in the thick of the fight, taking down one of Kazan's men with ruthless efficiency. Ellie's body moved on instinct, her gun raised as she aimed at the second man. The world seemed to slow down as she pulled the trigger, the sharp crack of the gun echoing in the warehouse. The man staggered, his weapon falling to the floor as he crumpled to the ground. But Kazan was still standing, his eyes locked onto hers with a mixture of contempt and amusement. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "This is just the beginning. You don't even know what's coming for you." Ellie didn't have time to respond. Before she could react, Kazan lunged at her, his hand reaching for her throat. She barely managed to dodge his grasp, her body twisting out of the way just in time. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scrambled backward, trying to put space between herself and him. Alejandro was there in an instant, his body moving like a blur as he tackled Kazan to the ground. The two men grappled, each one fighting for control. The sound of their struggle echoed in the vast warehouse, the noise filling Ellie's ears as she tried to steady her breath. She watched helplessly as Alejandro and Kazan fought, their movements fast and brutal. There was no mercy in either of them. This wasn't just a fight, it was a battle for control, for survival. Ellie's gaze flicked to the other men, who were still dealing with Kazan's remaining henchmen. The gunfire was deafening now, the chaos a blur of movement and sound. It felt like a war zone, and she was trapped in the middle of it. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something shifted. Kazan's grip on Alejandro tightened, and in that moment, Ellie saw an opening. She rushed forward, her gun raised as she aimed at Kazan's back. Bang! The shot rang out, and Kazan let out a strangled gasp as he collapsed to the floor, his body hitting the concrete with a dull thud. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she stood over him, her heart racing. She had done it. She had helped bring him down. Alejandro stood up slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a mix of relief and something deeper. "You're all right," he said, his voice steady but with an undeniable edge of gratitude. Ellie nodded, her chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. She was shaking, but there was no time to focus on the aftermath. The hard drive. They had to find it. "Where is it?" Alejandro asked, his voice cold and urgent. Ellie's mind raced as she glanced around the warehouse. She had no idea, but as she looked down at the bodies on the ground, a thought occurred to her. Kazan had to have had it with him. She stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she crouched down beside Kazan's body, carefully searching him. And then her fingers brushed against something cold, something hard and metallic. A small, sleek device. Her breath caught in her throat as she pulled the hard drive from Kazan's jacket pocket. She had found it. Ellie's hands trembled as she held the hard drive in her palm. It felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of the lives lost and the secrets contained within it were pressing down on her. She looked at Alejandro, who was watching her with an intensity that was both reassuring and terrifying. "We have it," she said, her voice hoarse. Alejandro nodded, his expression unreadable as he stepped closer, his hand extending to take the hard drive. "This is everything," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is the key to ending it all." Ellie hesitated for a moment, reluctant to let go of it. It wasn't just a piece of data anymore. It was a symbol of everything that had happened to her. The lies, the danger, the shifting power dynamics. Her father's hidden world, Kazan's cruelty, and Alejandro's dangerous promise to protect her. All of it was tied to this small, unassuming device. She finally handed it over, and Alejandro's fingers brushed hers as he took it from her. For a split second, their eyes locked, and Ellie saw something in him that she hadn't noticed before. A vulnerability, a fleeting moment of uncertainty. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. "Are you sure this is the right way to end it?" Alejandro didn't answer immediately. He stood there, his gaze flicking to the body of Kazan, now lying lifeless on the cold concrete floor. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of his decision. "This was always the plan," he said finally, his voice colder now. The moment Kazan came into play, this was going to be the only way to end it. The hard drive holds everything. The truth about your father, the evidence of Kazan's operations, the lives he's ruined. It all leads back to this moment. Ellie could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she absorbed his words. It wasn't just about the hard drive anymore. It was about everything she had learned, everything that had been hidden from her. Her father had been more than just a man who had passed away in a tragic accident. He had been a part of this world, a world filled with corruption, betrayal, and endless power struggles. The realization hit her harder than she expected. "And you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me? Why are you involved in this?" Alejandro's eyes met hers again. this time without the cold detachment that had marked his earlier actions. For the first time, he seemed human, his vulnerability laid bare. "I'm involved because I made a promise to protect you, and I'm not walking away from it." Ellie's chest tightened. "And when this is over?" She couldn't bring herself to ask the question directly, but it hung between them, unanswered and unresolved. What would happen to them, to her? Alejandro didn't answer right away. He looked down at the hard drive in his hand, his fingers lightly tracing its smooth surface. It was a small object, but it held so much power, so much potential for destruction. "When this is over," he said slowly, "everything changes. For both of us." Ellie didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she could believe him. Not after everything that had happened. There was too much at stake. Too many lives lost. Too many dangerous forces at play. But in that moment, she made a choice. A choice that had been building ever since she'd met Alejandro. She had no idea where this road would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't walk away from him. Not now. "We need to leave," Alejandro said, breaking her thoughts. "We can't stay here. Kazan's men will be here any minute." Ellie nodded, feeling a surge of urgency. She wanted to leave, wanted to escape this nightmare, but the truth of what she had learned weighed heavily on her, pressing down on her shoulders like a 1,000-ton boulder. She had made a choice to stay, but that didn't make it any easier. The group moved quickly, leaving the warehouse behind. Marco and the other men gathered the remaining supplies, ensuring the perimeter was secure before they left. Ellie's mind raced, her body on high alert, as they made their way to the SUV. Alejandro was already inside, his eyes scanning the surroundings as the engine roared to life. Marco slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel with the same intensity that Ellie had seen earlier. As they sped away from the warehouse, Ellie glanced back at the building that had been the site of so many secrets. The place where everything had started to unravel. "We're going to the safe house," Alejandro said, his voice firm. "It's time to put an end to this." Ellie didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she was ready for the end. She wasn't sure she could face the consequences of everything she had learned. But she knew one thing. There was no going back now. As the city's lights faded behind them, Ellie's thoughts turned inward. She had always thought she knew her father, thought she understood who he was and what he had done. But now, she realized that the truth was far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. Her father wasn't the man she had thought him to be. He was part of a dangerous world, one that had now claimed her as its own. And Alejandro, she didn't know where he fit into all of this, but as the miles ticked by, and the silence between them grew heavier, one thing became clear. Whatever happened next, Ellie would face it with him. She didn't have any other choice. The SUV continued to cut through the night, the city skyline gradually disappearing behind them as they drove further into the outskirts. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound inside the car, broken only by the occasional rustle of movement. Ellie sat in the back seat, her mind still reeling from the revelation about her father, the hard drive, and Kazan's relentless pursuit. She glanced over at Alejandro, who was sitting next to her, his face unreadable. The last few hours had been a blur of tension and chaos, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in deeper than she had ever imagined. There was no returning to the life she had known. No going back to the quiet, simple world she had built for herself. She had entered a world of secrets, betrayal, and deadly power struggles. And now she was part of it, whether she liked it or not. Alejandro's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're almost there." Ellie nodded, but she didn't say anything. She couldn't quite bring herself to ask what came next. What would happen when they reached the safe house? Would the danger be over? Or was this just another step in a never-ending cycle of threats and violence? The SUV slowed as they approached a gate, the large iron bars creaking open as Marco expertly guided the vehicle inside. Ellie's eyes scanned the surroundings, an isolated estate, surrounded by dense trees and high walls. The house itself was grand, but there was an air of seclusion and silence that made Ellie's skin crawl. "Welcome to the safe house," Alejandro said, his tone detached but still with a hint of finality. The car rolled to a stop in front of the main entrance, and Ellie couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her stomach. This was it, the place where they would hide, regroup, and hopefully end this nightmare. but something about it felt off. It was too quiet, too perfect, as though they were being watched from every angle. "Come on," Alejandro said, his voice low. He opened the door and stepped out, signaling for Ellie to follow. She hesitated for a moment before getting out of the SUV. Marco and the other men were already moving toward the entrance, checking their surroundings, their weapons ready. It was clear they were taking no chances. The quiet air of the safe house was only an illusion of safety. Alejandro led the way inside, his movements precise and confident. The interior was as grand as the exterior, but it had an air of practicality. It wasn't the kind of place for luxury. It was a fortress, built to withstand whatever danger might come. "This is where we'll regroup," Alejandro said as he led her through the main hallway, his hand resting lightly on the back of her neck as he guided her along. "We'll stay here for the night, get our bearings, and figure out how to take down Kazan once and for all." Ellie felt a surge of unease. Kazan was still out there, still hunting her, and he wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. What did Alejandro really have planned? And how much longer would she be trapped in this dangerous world, fighting to stay alive? They reached a large open room with plush furniture and a fireplace that cast a soft glow across the space. It was elegant, but there was nothing warm about it. Ellie could feel the coldness of the place, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. "We've got work to do," Alejandro said, turning to face her as he moved toward a desk at the far side of the room. He pulled out a laptop, the soft click of the keys filling the silence. "We need to decrypt the information on the hard drive. Once we do that, we'll know exactly where Kazan's operation is hiding." Ellie stood in the center of the room, watching him work. Her mind raced, but she couldn't focus on anything. Her father, Kazan, the hard drive, it was all too much. She felt the weight of it all in her chest, the suffocating pressure that had built up ever since she'd answered that damn phone call. "You don't have to do this alone," Alejandro said, his voice quiet but firm, pulling her from her thoughts. Ellie looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something in his eyes, something that softened the hard edges of his persona. "I don't know how to keep going," she whispered. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do." Alejandro closed the laptop, turning to face her fully. "You're stronger than you think, Ellie. You've made it this far. You can make it the rest of the way." She shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But you're in it now, and I'll protect you. I promised you that." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. She had been so focused on the dangers around her, on the men hunting her, that she hadn't really stopped to consider Alejandro's role in all of this. He wasn't just a dangerous mafia boss. He was someone who had made a choice to protect her, even when he didn't have to. "I don't know what's going to happen next," Ellie said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to survive this." Alejandro reached out, gently cupping her face with his hand, his thumb brushing away the tear that had slipped down her cheek. "You don't have to know everything. You just have to trust me." She stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. In that moment, she realized that despite all the danger, despite everything that had happened, she had begun to trust him, maybe more than she should. Ellie nodded slowly. "I'll trust you." He gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Good. Now let's end this." You said. The night passed in a blur of tense silence, the weight of the hard drive and its contents looming over Ellie like a storm waiting to break. She lay awake in the safe house, the muffled sounds of Alejandro's men working in the next room filtering through the walls. The air was thick with anticipation, and despite the luxurious surroundings, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that she was still very much a prisoner of this dangerous world. Her mind kept returning to the same question. How far was she willing to go to survive this? How much of herself would she have to sacrifice to bring down Kazan and protect the truth her father had hidden? The soft glow of the moonlight through the curtains was the only source of light in the room, casting long shadows on the floor as Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. Her thoughts were scattered, bouncing between her father's secret life, Kazan's men, and Alejandro, who had become both her protector and her anchor in this storm. But who was Alejandro, really? What did he want from her? What was he willing to sacrifice to keep her safe? She had trusted him, even when she didn't understand why. But now, in the stillness of the night, She couldn't help but wonder if she was being pulled into something darker than she had imagined. Ellie stood, pacing across the room as her thoughts swirled. She couldn't stay passive anymore. She had to make a decision, a choice that would determine the rest of her life. She had been dragged into this world, yes, but she still had a say in how it would end. There was a knock at the door, and Ellie froze. She had expected it to be Alejandro, but the voice that followed was Marco's. "Ellie," Marco called softly through the door. "Alejandro wants to see you." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. She knew what that meant. The final confrontation with Kazan was coming. Everything had been building up to this moment, and now there was no turning back. She opened the door and Marco's eyes met hers, his expression unreadable. "It's time," he said. Ellie nodded, taking a deep breath as she followed Marco down the hallway. Her legs felt heavy with the weight of what was to come, but she pushed forward. She wasn't going to run from this anymore. She had already made her choice. When they entered the room, Alejandro was standing by a large desk, a map spread out in front of him. His back was to her, but he didn't need to turn around for Ellie to know he had been expecting her. "Ellie," he said, his voice low and commanding. He turned to face her, his eyes dark and serious. "We have one shot at this. Are you ready?" Ellie stepped into the room, her resolve hardening. She had spent too long questioning her place in this world. It was time to stop asking questions and start taking action. If she was going to survive this, if she was going to honor her father's legacy, she had to do it on her own terms. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. "Let's finish this." Alejandro nodded, his gaze flickering with something unreadable before he turned back to the map. "Good. Kazan's men will be at the docks by midnight. We have to get there first, cut off their access to the hard drive, and make sure they don't escape." Ellie studied the map, her mind working quickly as she processed the plan. The docks. It was where everything had started, and now it would be where it would end. She knew this would be the most dangerous part of it all. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. "Marco," Alejandro said, turning to the bodyguard. "Get the team ready. Ellie, stay with me. We need to be sure everything goes according to plan." Ellie nodded, taking her position beside Alejandro as they prepared to leave. The moment of truth was finally here. Kazan's men were within reach, and this would be the endgame. As they made their way to the vehicles, Ellie's heart pounded with anticipation. She could feel the weight of the hard drive in her pocket, the small object that had brought her to this point. It wasn't just a piece of data. It was a key to her father's past, a key to unlocking the truth. And now, it was up to her to decide how the story would end. The drive to the docks was a blur of headlights and the low hum of the engine. Ellie sat in the back of the SUV, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, trying to steady her breathing. The city lights seemed to fade as they moved further from the heart of it, the darkness of the outskirts swallowing them whole. The weight of what was about to happen pressed heavily on her chest. She glanced at Alejandro, who sat in the front seat, his face a mask of concentration. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the night, every detail in his surroundings calculated, just as it had been since they first met. It was as if he had been born for this kind of life, the danger, the conflict, the constant battle for control. Ellie, on the other hand, had never been prepared for this. She had been thrown into this world, unwillingly and without warning. But tonight she felt different. There was no fear anymore, only a cold determination. She would face this head on, and she would not let the darkness consume her. They reached the docks, the shadows growing longer as they pulled into the secluded area. The sound of the waves crashing against the docks was the only thing that filled the air, the quiet serenity of the water in stark contrast to the tension that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath them. Alejandro was the first to step out of the SUV, his movements quick and fluid, as if he were already prepared for whatever awaited them. Ellie followed, her heart pounding in her chest, her steps echoing in the eerie silence of the night. The docks were deserted, the only sign of life the flickering lights from the warehouses lining the water. "We need to move fast," Alejandro said, his voice low and urgent. "Kazan's men are close." Ellie nodded, gripping the gun that had been tucked into the waistband of her jeans. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. She had no illusions left. She knew that either she would walk away from this night, or she wouldn't walk away at all. They moved quickly through the shadows, the team spreading out, ensuring that every possible angle was covered. Ellie's mind was focused, her senses heightened. She was ready, but as they approached the old warehouse at the far end of the docks, she felt the familiar prickle of unease creeping up her spine. "This is it," Alejandro murmured, his voice barely audible as he signaled for the team to stop. "Once we go in, there's no turning back." Ellie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Let's end this." The warehouse door was slightly ajar, the faint sound of voices filtering out from inside. Ellie's grip on her weapon tightened. The plan was simple: get inside, locate Kazan's men, and secure the hard drive. Alejandro moved first, his body low as he slipped into the building, his men following close behind. Ellie stayed close, her footsteps silent against the cold concrete. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. The beams of light from their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the stacks of crates and boxes that filled the space. Ellie's heart raced as her eyes flicked from one shadow to another, every corner of the room seeming to hold a potential threat. And then she saw them. A group of men stood around a table, their attention focused on the small object in the center of the room, the hard drive. Kazan's men. Ellie's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Alejandro raised his hand, signaling for the team to move in. But just as they started to move forward, the sound of a gunshot rang out, echoing in the vast space. Ellie flinched, her heart skipping a beat as she instinctively dropped to the ground, the world around her exploding into chaos. "Move!" Alejandro's voice was a roar over the noise of gunfire, his men taking cover behind crates and stacks of boxes. Ellie's instincts kicked in. She ducked behind a large crate, her breath coming in short bursts as she steadied herself. She could feel the weight of the weapon in her hands, the cold metal familiar now. She peeked out from behind the crate, aiming at one of Kazan's men who was trying to make a run for it. Bang! The shot rang out, and the man fell, his body crumpling to the ground. But the chaos wasn't over. More men appeared from the shadows, their weapons raised as they opened fire. Ellie's mind raced as she ducked back behind the crate, the sound of bullets flying over her head sending a wave of adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was real now. No more hiding, no more questions. Alejandro's men moved swiftly, their precision and training evident as they took down the remaining men one by one. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as the fight continued, the gunfire ringing in her ears. Through the haze of smoke and chaos, she saw Kazan. He was standing near the far end of the warehouse, his dark eyes locked onto hers. He was holding the hard drive. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The man responsible for everything, her father's death, the destruction of her world, was standing in front of her, holding the very thing that had torn everything apart. She didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon and aimed. Bang! The bullet hit its mark, but Kazan didn't fall. Instead, he grinned, his face twisted with malice. "You think you've won?" Kazan's voice was taunting, his grin widening. "You're just a pawn in this game, Ellie. You always have been." Ellie's anger flared, her vision clouded by the rage building inside her. "I'm not a pawn," she spat, her voice sharp with conviction. "I'm the one who's going to end this." With that, she fired again. And this time the shot was true. Kazan crumpled to the floor, the hard drive slipping from his hand as he fell. Silence descended upon the warehouse as the last of Kazan's men were subdued. Ellie stood still, her heart still pounding in her chest as she looked down at the fallen man. This was over. Kazan was dead, but it wasn't over for Ellie. Not yet. Alejandro approached her, his eyes scanning the room before settling on her. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and something else she couldn't quite place. Ellie looked down at the hard drive, the object that had brought them all here. It was still the key to everything, the key to her father's legacy, to Kazan's downfall, and to whatever future awaited her. But now it was time for Ellie to make a decision. She could walk away from this world, leave it all behind, or she could stay and fight for what was right. But as she looked at Alejandro, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. The warehouse was silent now, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. The weight of what had just happened settled over Ellie like a heavy cloak. But it wasn't the same weight she had carried before. This time it felt different. Lighter almost. The fight had been brutal, but it was over. Kazan was dead. The hard drive was in her hands, and the man who had once seemed like a ruthless, untouchable force now lay at her feet, just another casualty of the world she had been pulled into. Ellie's hand trembled as she held the hard drive, the small, innocuous device that had changed everything. It was the key to everything her father had been involved in. It held the secrets that had led to her father's death, the secrets that had torn her life apart. But now it was over. She had ended it. Alejandro stepped up beside her, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring there were no more surprises. His expression was unreadable, but there was a shift in the way he moved. It was subtle, but Ellie could feel it. This had changed him too. "You did good," he said quietly, his voice steady, but with an unmistakable note of approval. "It's over." Ellie didn't reply at first. Her mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Kazan was gone, but that didn't mean the world she had been thrust into would simply disappear. There was still so much to figure out, so much that she still didn't understand. "Now what?" she finally asked, her voice soft but filled with the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. Alejandro turned to her, his gaze intense. He didn't speak right away, as if weighing her question. When he did finally respond, it was with the kind of calm certainty that had defined him from the beginning. "Now we move forward," he said. "We take the hard drive to the right people, make sure Kazan's network falls apart for good. And after that," he trailed off, his voice hesitant for the first time, "we figure out where you fit into all of this." Ellie looked at him, unsure what he meant. "And what about you? What happens to you?" Alejandro stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "That depends on you." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Ellie felt the tension in the room shift, the weight of the decision she now faced pressing down on her. She had always felt like she didn't belong in this world, the world of power, corruption, and bloodshed. But now it felt different. She had fought her way through it. She had survived. "I don't know what I want anymore," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't go back to the way things were." Alejandro studied her carefully, his gaze softening just slightly. "You don't have to go back, Ellie. That life is gone now, just as much as your father's past is. You have the choice to create something new, but it's up to you to decide what that looks like." Ellie looked down at the hard drive in her hand, the weight of it now symbolic of everything she had been through. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something: clarity, strength, a sense of purpose. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about moving forward, about finding her place in a world that had always seemed too big, too dangerous, for her to navigate. She turned her gaze back to Alejandro, the man who had been by her side through it all, guiding her, protecting her. There was no doubt in her mind that their paths were now intertwined. How far that path would take them, she didn't know. But she was no longer afraid to walk it. "I don't have all the answers," she said, her voice steady. "But I want to try. I want to figure this out, with you." Alejandro's expression shifted again, his lips curving into a small, genuine smile. For the first time, it wasn't a smile born of manipulation or control. It was a smile of understanding, of connection. He stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone," he said quietly. "I'll be with you every step of the way." Ellie nodded, her heart finally finding a measure of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she felt like she had a choice. A real choice, and with Alejandro by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. The hard drive, the key to her father's past, was still in her hand. But it no longer held the same power over her. It was no longer a burden. It was a means to an end, a way to dismantle the chaos her father had left behind. Now, she had the power to rewrite her own story, and for the first time, Ellie Morgan felt like she was truly free.